Alright folks, welcome back to the fourth video in the series and also the second review of a book. Now, this is my first review of an actual proper novel. I'm very excited to make Earth Abides my second review. It's one of the books that's really sort of changed who I am, particularly some of the research I did after I read this book. It's a great book. This book was actually Jimi Hendrix's favorite book he had ever written. In fact, it actually influenced one of his songs. This book was actually one of Stephen King's favorite books. It actually heavily influenced The Stand. So if you like The Stand, this is where he got a lot of his ideas from, and so forth. Before we talk about the book, Earth Abides, and its context and its history and why I love it so much, I want to talk a little bit about the author, George Stewart. He's a little bit of a different writer. He's definitely sort of a Renaissance man for his time. He graduated from an Ivy League school, had a PhD. He was an academic. He actually created sort of the field of names and name study in America with English names. He actually was the co-founder of a society that actually studies names. So for him, the concept of names is very important. You're going to see that in the book itself. The science fiction novel he ever wrote was Earth Abides, which we're going to be talking about extensively here as part of this review. He also wrote a few other stories too. For example, he wrote some about some storms that hit. Based on those, the Meteorological Society decided to use people names to name storms based on the hurricane named Maria from his story. So again, there is this. He's had some influence and some things outside of this, but Earth Abides is today basically the work that he's known for outside of academic circles that study sort of place and people names and such. So he sets out to write Earth Abides. Now, if you know from somebody who cares about names, he's not going to choose the name of his characters or his novel out of a hat. These are not going to be things he's just going to choose because they sound nice. They're going to have meaning to him and to the reader. So Earth Abides, already you're going to be able to tell something just from the title. Earth Abides is actually from Ecclesiastes. It's one of the early verses in Ecclesiastes. And it says, "Man comes and man goes, but Earth abides." As a general rule, I find that when writers use a famous and strong a poetic language from the Old Testament as the title for their work, they're going to try to aim for very much high literary standards, like "By the waters of Babylon," or "Do not forsake me, O Jerusalem." And Earth Abides is in that sort of genre. It's a famous verse, "Man comes, man goes, but Earth abides." And so by tapping into that with the title of the book, you know, the author, Stewart, is going to tell you that this is going to try to tap into that sort of mythopoeic element that he wants to bring in. You're even going to see the names of his characters. His main character, Ish, is a man. That's actually Hebrew for man. His main character, a female character, is Emma, which is Hebrew for mother. So again, he's going to try to give you this sort of mythic element in the story. And that's going to be one of the main things that Stewart's going to try to do in this story. It's a post-apocalyptic story. It's written right after World War II has ended. It's in the early years of the Cold War, but before the Cold War really became the Cold War, with a lot of its sort of genres and understandings and hatreds of each side. So as a result, it's kind of in that sort of post-World War II innocence stage, where everything's sort of fresh. And he's going to have a very different take on sort of a post-apocalyptic work. In his in the first chapter of his work, the post-apocalyptic event is just a disease, and like any disease, there's going to be a small number of people that survive, that are immune to it, and such. So he has a small number of people that are going to survive with these various remnants across the earth. Now, he really is fascinated by this idea, and I love this idea. I think it's very resonant. The traditional sort of parabola for most of the post-apocalyptic works that happen, that you are reading about, has, after whatever the apocalyptic event is, meteor hits the planet, a disease, a zombie apocalypse, whatever. Whatever your apocalyptic event is, then what tends to happen is right after this event, there's an immediate fall down. And that fall kind of, we're now free from the structures, the government, and so forth. So we're going to turn on each other, we're going to raid, we're going to be barbarians, and so forth. Right after this apocalyptic event, we're going to fall. But then we're going to slowly rebuild civilization and society as we realize what we were missing. We're kind of idiots all along, right? And so many of these famous sort of post-apocalyptic works, from Mad Max and other cinematic ones, to novels and such during this era, are going to have this sort of quick fall and then slowly rebuild over time as we realize what we were missing and how good we had it. That's sort of the traditional parabola. But George Stewart ignores that parabola. Instead, his initial apocalyptic event happens. In this case, it's the disease. And then we cling on to our social structures. There is no immediate fall. We immediately cling onto our social structures and all these various things that we've created that have no relevance in this new world. And then slowly over time, we're going to descend until we've hit this sort of primal state. But in addition to that sort of parabola, he also has a lot of other things that he wants to address sort of in this work. One of the things that he does is, again, he has this mythic element concept. His main character, Ish, is going to come across this woman, Emma. They're going to immediately connect and grow a family together. One of the interesting things is that although this book is written really early and kind of outside the genreification of post-apocalyptic fiction, which gives it room to breathe, he can write the story he wants to write rather than being forced to write a traditional post-apocalyptic story. Emma is actually a black woman of African descent. He doesn't mention it. It's not a lead. He doesn't talk about her as this black woman. He doesn't say, it's not in the back cover. You're not going to say anywhere where they say, oh, well, it was a black woman. He doesn't lead with it. It's not a major point, but she is. Every physical description of her in the book shows that she's of African descent. But it's never actually stated just, I married a black woman, or anything like that. Which means that all the people that are descendants of Ish and Emma are going to then be biracial, which is going to be most of the people in the book that you're going to follow along. The book has this very strong mythic component to it. Stewart was absolutely trying to knock it out of the park with this book and show and such. But the book is incredibly good. It's incredibly well written. Stewart is a very strong wordsmith, but not in a traditional sort of an H.P. Lovecraft or a Clark Ashton Smith or an Ambrose Bierce, who you will read something from and you will say, wow, this sentence was so clever, or they will just try to show you with almost in a braggadocio way how many different words they know from the dictionary. Instead, he does it much more subtly, which I enjoy. His style of writing builds up the suspense, builds up the drama. He really cares about the characters and how they interact with each other. It's not just, here's a post-apocalyptic work, no, here's my tour, which will actually happen in the early stages of the book. But instead, he really cares more about the society that they're going to build and sort of the human interaction and interplay. There are some of these interesting sort of commentaries, conversations, and sort of investigations and so forth into his post-apocalyptic world and the sort of interplay that happens between people in this world. And again, this was heavily influential from Hendricks to Stephen King, people who have really, really enjoyed this book. I myself have purchased this book for other people because I like it so much. Whenever I read a book like this, one of the things I like to do is take a look online and see who has reviewed it and see if there are reviews of this book or this short story or this novella, if they are similar to mine, if they had similar takes to mine, and such. So I think that's really cool. And so I did that for Earth Abides. And when I searched up the Google search, I found this Boston Globe review of Earth Abides, and it had in it this writer for the Boston Globe Review from the early 2000s, and in it he talked about this book being a perfect example, a totemic example of what he calls this sort of old book classics that are forgotten, that are no longer with us. And he uses this quote that I had never heard of before, but this quote really resonated with me, and it's the motto of this channel. And it's a quote from an 18th century French philosopher named Jacques Joubert. And Joubert stated that the worst thing about new books is that they keep us from reading old books, which is to me a very compelling point. Because there are always going to be these great older books out there that are amazing, that are cheap to buy, free, that are the best of their genre, that are fresh, that have been awarded many awards and so forth, that you and I still haven't read. So why am I reading the newest, random, quick read off of, the local shelves or the local Amazon store or the local, Barnes and Noble? Why am I not instead reading something that are these great old classics? And he used that to apply to Earth Abides and show how Earth Abides is in fact a lost treasure, even though it came from the Cold War era. That it's a perfect example of how us reading new books is keeping us from the old ones that are these great classics and such. That to me was very resonant after I read that and realized that's who I am. I started pushing myself to reading some of these older works even more. So this work itself, and in particular the Boston Globe Review and Joubert's quote, are things that really sort of hit me and hit me hard. And have been things that I've taken with me since then. Check it out. I think you'll like it. And check it out in the comments below. If you have read it, I would love to talk with you and engage with you about the book. And if you've heard about it, if you heard about Stephen King talking about it, maybe in a podcast, or reading about how The Stand came to be, or if you love that Jimi Hendrix song that was inspired by this novel, but you never actually set out to read the novel, hey, read the novel. It's not going to be a wasted day, I promise you. And again, if you do, feel free to comment in the comments below. I would love to talk with you about it more. Again, I'd also love to hear about your take on whether you think the more traditional view of a post-apocalyptic world, where we fall quickly from grace and then rebuild from the ashes, or instead where we are just slowly falling over time in order to rebuild society. Which one of those two do you think is going to be more likely to be the case? Because I think that's an interesting conversation too. Thank you again so much for taking some time out of your day. I know that you all have busy days and busy lives, and if you've gone this far into my video, then you actually watched it. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. Also, feel free to subscribe, and below check out some of my other videos. I'd love to have you comment on those and check those out as well. Thank you so much, and have a great